fixing Judy's hair.
Oh, you're welcome.
Mommy, that bowman's in the bathroom and there's something hard in his pants.
In April of 2025, Larry David published an op-ed in the New York Times comparing having dinner with a friend of his to having dinner with Adolf Hitler. He didn't get cancelled, he got praised. A few months later, he screamed at one of the most powerful lawyers in America in the middle of a grocery store, and the internet sided with him instantly, before anyone even asked what the fight was actually about. He has spent almost 30 years playing the most insufferable version of himself on television, a man who fights with waiters over bread, judges people for how they eat chocolate, and treats parking etiquette like a constitutional crisis. And somehow that man is one of the most beloved figures in American comedy. Nobody else gets away with what Larry David gets away with, not most of his own friends. So the real question isn't, is Larry David funny?
You named your dog Adolf? Hey, Hitler!
The real question is, why is he untouchable? And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what the answer is, because it's not luck. Here's why this matters right now, in 2026 and not 5 years ago. Larry David just came back. After ending Curb Your Enthusiasm, he could have disappeared into a quiet, wealthy retirement. Instead, he partnered with a former president of the United States to make a sketch comedy show about American history, right in the middle of one of the most politically exhausting stretches this country has seen in decades. At the same time, he's never been more politically outspoken, more publicly at war with old friends, or more willing to torch a relationship over a difference of opinion. Most public figures who take that kind of stance lose half of their audience. Larry David didn't. If anything, the people who agree with him love him more, and even a lot of the people who don't agree with him still can't look away. That's the actual mystery here, not what happened in his career. You can get that from Wikipedia. The mystery is how one specific comedic persona became powerful enough to survive controversy that would end others' careers, and what that says about what audiences actually forgive and what they don't. To understand that, you have to go all the way back to where this persona was actually built.
Who is Larry David?
This guy.
Larry David was born in 1947 and raised in Sheepshead Bay, in a lower middle-class Jewish household. His father worked in the garment industry, and his mother worked various jobs to help support the family. It was not a glamorous upbringing, and David has said openly that he never expected much out of his life. He described himself in his own words as someone who assumed he'd end up doing something ordinary and forgettable. That mindset matters because it's the origin of everything that makes his comedy work later. He grew up watching the small unfair indignities of everyday life, and instead of shrugging them off the way most people do, he kept score. He went to the University of Maryland, served briefly in the Army Reserve, and drifted through a string of jobs that have since become comedy legend in their own right. A limousine driver, a store clerk, even a bra salesman.
I was a bra salesman for a while. I was also a private chauffeur.
Did you have ambitions to a greater success, a greater life?
No, nothing.
He turned to stand-up comedy in the 1970s, working the same New York circuit as comedians like Jerry Seinfeld, and by most accounts, including his own, he was bad at it. Not untalented, just constitutionally unsuited to a room that wanted him to be liked. He'd walk off stage mid-set if a crowd wasn't responding the way he wanted. He treated audience approval as something to be earned on his terms, not chased. It's the exact same posture you'll see in every character he ever plays. That refusal to perform likability is the blueprint. Everything else is the execution. In 1980, David got his first real break as a writer and cast member on Fridays, ABC's answer to Saturday Night Live. It ran for 3 seasons and never reached SNL's level of cultural weight, but it gave David his first real writer's room, and it's where he first crossed paths with people who'd shape the next stage of his career. Then, in 1984, he was hired as a writer on Saturday Night Live, during a rocky transitional season for the show. This is where the Larry David legend actually starts, and it has almost nothing to do with anything that aired. David got exactly 1 sketch on air the entire season. He was famously miserable there, convinced the show's producers didn't respect his writing. And then came the moment that became comedy folklore.
I walked up and I said, "I'm done, I've had it, take your show, shove it." So I walked in on Monday, and they were looking at me going, what the hell are you doing here?
That story later became the entire premise for one of the most famous Seinfeld episodes ever. George quitting his job on a on whim and then just showing up like nothing happened. This matters because it tells you something crucial about how Larry David works as a writer. He doesn't invent absurdity. He mines it directly from his own most embarrassing, petty, and irrational real-life behavior, and then he refuses to sand off the edges. Most writers would clean that story up to make the character more sympathetic. David does the opposite. By the late 1980s, David reconnected with Jerry Seinfeld, and together they pitched NBC on something deliberately unambitious, a show about how two comedians would come up with material for a TV pilot. NBC wasn't impressed. The pilot barely got ordered. Critically, almost nobody outside the network believed in it. What became Seinfeld eventually reshaped what a sitcom was allowed to be. The show had no sentimental lessons, no hugging, no character growth, a rule David enforced almost religiously in the writer's room. Characters were allowed to be selfish, petty, and completely unrepentant, and the show never punished them narratively for it, at least not in any way that felt like moral instruction. Episodes were built around suspiciously small stakes: a marked up rental car, a parking spot, a soup vendor with an attitude. That structure is a direct extension of the instinct David had as a struggling stand-up comedian and an unhappy SNL writer. He wasn't inventing a new comedic philosophy from scratch. He was finally given a large enough platform to apply the one he'd always had. David served as a co-creator and head writer for the first 7 seasons, and by most accounts, he was the primary architect of the show's tone and structure. Even as Seinfeld became its face, he left the show in 1996, before its final season, reportedly because he felt he'd said everything he had to say, a decision that at the time looked borderline insane to nearly everyone around him.
Watching Larry David craft a joke like a surgeon, and Jerry and he working together like talking in a language you can't really understand unless you're on the inside.
Walking away from one of the most successful sitcoms in America is not a normal career move. It's a Larry David move. He came back briefly to write the divisive series finale in 1998, but by then the character he'd need for his next act was already fully formed. He just hadn't put himself in front of the camera yet. In 1999, HBO aired a 1-hour mockumentary special following Larry David, playing a semi-fictionalized version of himself as he prepared to come out of retirement for a stand-up special. It was framed as a behind-the-scenes look at his life. It became Curb Your Enthusiasm, and it ran on and off for 12 seasons across 24 years, ending in 2024. Curb did something almost no show had done successfully before. It took the exact philosophy of Seinfeld and applied it directly to a character using David's real name, his real house, and his real social circle, largely improvised on loose outlines rather than a written script.
You did Curb Your Enthusiasm.
Yeah.
Is there any script?
No, there's no script. Larry David sends out a little breakdown of the scenes that you're in.
The show turned Larry David into a specific American archetype, the man who is technically correct about a social rule nobody else cares about, and who will burn every relationship in his life defending that rule to the end. Whether it's the chat and cut at a party, correct chocolate eating etiquette, or the socially acceptable amount of time to wait before remarrying a widow, the through line never changes. David's character treats minor social contracts as sacred, and he treats actual human warmth as optional. The genius of it is that the show never asks you to think David was a good person. It asks you to admit that you secretly had the exact same thought he's saying out loud, and you were too much of a coward to say it. That's the entire contract between the show and its audience, and it's why the show built one of its most loyal fan bases in modern television, spanning almost a quarter century without losing its core identity. Now, by the time Curb ended, Larry David had become inseparable from Larry David, the person, in the public imagination, which set up exactly the kind of controversy that was coming next. This is where things get complicated, and it's worth slowing down because this is the part of the story that actually explains everything else. In April 2025, Larry David published a satirical essay in the New York Times titled My Dinner with Adolf. Written from a first-person perspective, it imagined David having a private dinner with Adolf Hitler in 1939, and coming away surprised by how personable and human he seemed. David never named names in the piece. He didn't have to. It landed just weeks after his longtime friend Bill Maher had dinner at the White House with the President Trump, and then publicly described him on his own show as unexpectedly gracious in person. The Times opinion editor stepped in with a companion piece explaining the intent, that David wasn't equating Trump with Hitler. Hitler, but making a point about how easy it is to mistake a pleasant private moment for actual character. Maher didn't see it that way. He called the piece insulting, argued that involving Hitler forfeits any argument automatically, and pointed out that David's own body of work, from the Soup Nazi to plenty of Holocaust adjacent jokes over the years, made the outrage feel selective. The two men, by Maher's own account, stopped speaking after it published. Here's the part that matters for understanding David specifically. The essay didn't hurt him. If anything, it strengthened his standing with the audience that already agreed with him, while giving him a very public, very specific enemy in Maher, which, if you understand David's comedic instincts at all, is basically raw material. Then there's the Dershowitz situation, which is even more revealing because it wasn't written, it was real. Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz had been a genuine, decades-long friend of David's, the kind of friend who helps you get your kid into college, the kind whose gym you use. After Dershowitz publicly defended his ties to the Trump administration, the two men ran into each other in a Martha Vineyard's grocery store, and David reportedly confronted him directly, telling him it was disgusting to see him standing with former Trump officials. Dershowitz has since said more than once that the curmudgeon on Curb was never really a character, that this is simply who Larry David is, minus the edits. And notice what happened publicly when that story broke. The internet didn't side with the powerful Harvard lawyer. It sided almost unanimously with the guy who screamed at his old friend in a grocery store over politics. That's the pattern. See, time after time, Larry David picks a fight rooted in something that looks on the surface exactly like a Curb Your Enthusiasm plot, an argument over a small specific violation that most people would let go. And because the audience has spent 25 years being trained to see that exact behavior as honest rather than cruel, they extend him the benefit of the doubt that almost nobody else in his position gets. He's not uncancelable because people agree with his politics. Plenty of people don't. He's uncancelable because the character he spent decades building taught an entire audience to read his bluntness as integrity instead of nastiness, even when it spills into his real life, even when it costs him real friendships. So what is the actual mechanism behind all of this? What makes his persona so durable? First, there's the improvisational structure of his work. Curb Your Enthusiasm was never fully scripted. David and his team built detailed outlines, sometimes 20 or 30 pages long, but the actual dialogue was improvised on set. That's an enormous risk. It means the show lives or dies on David's actual instincts in the moment, not on a writer polishing a joke over multiple drafts. The fact that it worked for 24 years is a testament to how precisely calibrated his sense of social friction actually is. He doesn't need a script to know exactly where the funniest, most uncomfortable version of an argument lives. Second, there's the specificity. David's comedy has never relied on big universal targets. It's built on absurdly narrow, absurdly specific grievances, the exact number of dessert bites that's socially acceptable, the correct protocol for returning a wave. That specificity is what makes it feel true instead of performed. Broad comedy asks you to laugh at a type of person. David's comedy asks you to recognize a moment you've actually lived through and never admitted out loud. Third, there's the total commitment to being unlikable without apologizing for it narratively. Most comedy, even dark comedy, eventually winks at the audience to reassure them the character secretly has a heart of gold. David refuses that. His character is petty in episode 1 and petty in the finale. There is no arc where he learns to be a better person, and audiences, it turns out, find that oddly more honest than the alternative. Put those three things together and you get a persona that reads as authentic even when you know intellectually that it's constructed. That authenticity is the entire reason his real-world controversies don't stick the way they would for anyone else. The audience isn't watching a celebrity misbehave, they're watching the bit continue. Which brings us to right now. After Curb ended in 2024, David didn't retire. In June 2026, he returned with Life, Larry, and the Pursuit of Unhappiness, a 7-episode HBO sketch series co-created with longtime collaborator Jeff Schaffer, and executive produced by Barack and Michelle Obama's production company, timed to the 250th anniversary of the United States. The premise drops David's exact same persona directly into major moments of American history. Critical reception has been mixed. The show holds middling scores on aggregator sites, with reviewers calling the sketches uneven, some sharper than anything in Curb's later seasons, others feeling like ideas that needed more room to breathe, but almost nobody is calling it boring, and nobody is questioning whether David still has it. The fact that a former US president chose to attach his name and his production company to Larry David's next project in this exact political moment tells you everything about about how bulletproof this persona has become. He didn't need to prove anything with this show. He did it anyway, because until he can walk outside without being annoyed by his fellow man, he's not done. So go back to the question we opened with. Why is Larry David untouchable? It's not because people agree with his politics. He's been in the middle of it constantly, from a Hitler-themed op-ed to a public grocery store screaming match with an old friend. It's not even just because he's funny, because plenty of funny people have been erased for far less. He's untouchable because for nearly 50 years, he has never once pretended to be someone he wasn't for your approval, and an entire audience learned over decades to read that refusal as honesty. That's the actual genius, not the jokes, the consistency behind them. If you did enjoy this video, make sure to subscribe, as I do continue making videos every single week